important strategic planning process, which is that much more necessary today. In addition, Daniel has worked in a multi-pronged and increasingly successful effort to build a resilient American Jewish social justice movement. I value the work we have been able to do together in those regards, and I cherish always his tough questions and his wise counsel. That said, what a time to be here and to be speaking about issues and challenges we confront in Israel and America, about some of the visible shared crises in these two countries, and about the extent to which many of those crises also exist in countries around the world, and sadly, are being handled poorly. So yes, I am the bearer of some bad news, but I promise you we will end on an upbeat note. You could not write a believable script that tells my current truth. Just listen to this. I was working on these remarks in London at a board meeting of an organization that does post-genocide work in Rwanda, listening to friends discuss the terrifying fallout from Brexit and the suspension of Parliament, checking my phone to learn that the Israeli election appeared to have produced another deadlock, and that Donald Trump, not content with generally spewing hatred and fomenting conflict, had in the last few days insulted Cokie Roberts on her death, said that California could not limit auto pollution, and declared war on San Francisco, the city to which I was flying. I want to look at three areas of concern tonight: gender, democracy, and immigration, focusing particularly on immigration. I want to look at how those issues play out in Israel and America and across the globe, and how the struggles to make change unite us. Our strong, progressive Jewish community needs to connect the dots and stand for human rights everywhere in the world. First, thank you. First, the shared crises of gender inequity and gender-based violence. In Israel, NIF is dealing, through your partnership with powerful grantee organizations, with forced separation at concerts and on public buses, with arguments claiming exclusion of women is based on religious sensitivity and should not be the business of the state, with a rise in domestic violence and actual femicide, particularly in the Arab-Israeli community, and with determined efforts to elect more women to office. Here in the States, we are dealing with the ongoing revelations of the Me Too movement, with continuing evidence of gross discrimination against women in the workforce, including in the Jewish community, and with the sad fact that when it comes to gender equity in politics, the United States ranks 78th in the world. Globally, the same problems exist, and the dimensions are huge. Women are regularly denied agency over their bodies and their lives. There are 18 million child marriages every year, girls blocked from school attendance and future employment, often living lives that reduce them to sex slaves and domestic servants. In country after country, in places like Mexico and El Salvador, there are explosions of murderous violence against women in both their homes and their communities, practices and policies that often lead women to flee for their lives. The challenges are similar to those we know, and the struggles to make change must be shared, both among us and between us and others. Second, the fundamental threats to democracy. The loss of those freedoms that our countries are supposed to ensure. The state denial of people's rights to assemble, to vote, and to speak our own truths. These are rising problems in the United States and in Israel, where our current national leaders appear to believe that human and civil rights should be extended only to people who agree with them. These are signs, as NIF recently noted, of creeping authoritarianism, and they demand our vigilance, our street protests, our legal challenges, our fierce commitment to voting rights, and our policy advocacy. And meanwhile, countries around the world are too often emulating the worst of what they see in the West, raising barriers to participation for their own citizens, physically attacking protesters, as in Hong Kong and India, and denying certain people the right to become citizens or even to enter their countries. That brings me to the issue I want to focus on most this evening, the global status of immigrants and refugees, an issue that is at the core of our Jewish history, that is the essence of our Jewish people. Let me tell you a story. Escaping from persecution and torture and expulsion, 23 men, women, and children set out in a wooden boat. The captain took them on in exchange for a substantial amount of money, and when the ship came to the end of its journey, the captain auctioned off their possessions, leaving them both homeless and penniless. And the local governor spoke up because he did not want this foreign element to enter. These refugees, can you guess their identity? Not, as you might have imagined, those fleeing recently across the Mediterranean from Libya or across the Aegean from Turkey. These 23 were traveling from Recife, Brazil, and arrived in the tiny Dutch outpost of New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island. And Peter Stuyvesant, the governor, concerned that they would bring great harm to his colony, wrote his bosses in Amsterdam these words: "The Jews have arrived with their customary usury and deceitful trading. They might become a charge in the coming winter. We have deemed it useful to require them to depart, praying that the deceitful race be not allowed further to infect and trouble this new colony." So yes, these were our ancestors on these American shores, and they stayed because the Dutch West India Company overruled Peter Stuyvesant, describing his request as inconsistent with reason and justice. Would that we heard such words more often today. Instead, more than 350 years later, there are 60 million immigrants and refugees worldwide, people fleeing violence and oppression, looking for safety, for sanctuary, and for asylum, and the world is determined to close its doors. You at NIF know the story in Israel. People come from other countries for work and are denied citizenship for their children and threatened with deportation. Africans walking literally across the Sinai Desert for freedom in what they see as a promised land encounter discrimination, hostility, imprisonment, and ugly back-channel efforts to deport them to countries where they never ever lived. And yes, of course, these refugees pose challenges, but these are challenges we would like to see Israel dealing with creatively and in the spirit in which we wanted to be welcomed throughout our history. And regrettably, that is not now the case. In America, the stories are longer standing and perhaps even more painful. We can salute the determination of early immigrants to come here for political and religious freedom, even as we note that they stole land from the indigenous peoples. And we can recognize with some pride efforts during the last several hundred years to welcome and protect others fleeing oppression, some of them our ancestors. But we have to acknowledge that too often this country has failed to live up to its own rhetoric. Ours is a country that passed laws, for example, in the 1920s, designed to keep out Asians, Jews, and those whom we saw as other. It was the existence of these laws that led to the refusal to let the St. Louis dock, some 15 years later, that denied entry to many other Jews and consigned them to their deaths. It was our country that interned Japanese American citizens. And it is our country, another promised land, that is today pursuing ugly and often murderous policies with a Muslim travel ban, a proposal to deport people who were here for life-saving medical treatment, a policy of separating families and putting people in cages, an increasingly sham structure for asylum hearings, and a proposal that we should admit no refugees this year. It is our country that is building walls, physical, legal, and rhetorical, that turn people against each other. Here we are then in 2019, two illiberal democracies that we know and want to love, closing or trying to close their borders, denying asylum to people in need, and helping to create a world climate of ugly nativism. These problems are visible also in the rest of the world, where countries feel strengthened in their discriminatory policies by what they see here, and are increasingly turning against their own residents and denying entry to others. Some quick examples. In South Africa, there is rising xenophobia leading to attacks on other African nationals, and a recent poll said that 60% of South Africans believe that other Africans are stealing their jobs and their benefits and are responsible for all crime. Sounds familiar. In places as diverse as Kenya and Cambodia, indigenous people are fighting to hold on to land they have lived on and farmed for centuries, land that is now being seized by multinational corporations and even by their own governments, driving them out of their homes and communities, leaving them no place to live. In the Dominican Republic, there is an ongoing battle being waged by the government against Dominicans of Haitian descent. People whose ancestors originally came across a border for work, have lived there for 3 generations, are today being denied citizenship rights, having their documentation confiscated, and being told again to return home to a country where they have never lived and do not speak the language. They are rendered stateless in their own country, an experience all too familiar to us as Jews. And in Burma, Myanmar, we have a similar story leading to an ongoing genocide against a Muslim minority, the Rohingya. The government militia has killed activist leaders, razed villages, told people to go back where they came from, and forced the outmigration of over 1 million people to dangerous refugee camps in Bangladesh. Okay, Ruth, that's enough. Problems of gender equity, threats to democracy, growing numbers of refugees, and contemporary genocide. Where is the good news? As you might have guessed, the good news is in the determination of people to fight back, in the leadership and moral courage of local organizers who often risk harm to themselves to pursue their visions of justice. The good news is in the existence and determination of civil society organizations that mobilize people and organize protests and take court cases and advocate in legislatures to change the way things are. The good news is in the willingness of organizations like NIF and AJWS to partner with leaders and groups that are making a difference, provide them with resources, and share in their struggles. Your wonderful NIF supports women and men uniting across difference to make change in their lives and to transform Israeli society. You were there in struggles against the occupation, against racism, against home demolitions, and for asylum seekers. You have begun to see more women winning municipal elections. You and your partners have won bans on deportation, established court protections against executive abuse of power, and incurred fierce attacks from the government, which suggests you are doing something right. Go right ahead. And AJWS, we partner to help women activists make change and build peace in Senegal, support massive efforts against child marriage in India, and win land rights court cases in Kenya. AJWS has built a Jewish coalition to fight for the Rohingya and advocate in Congress for the Burma Act, which would impose new sanctions on that government. And domestically, American organizations in both the Jewish and secular communities take deportation cases, fight in the streets and the courts to preserve and enhance voting rights, protest the situation on our borders, and advocate for asylum protections. That is, seriously, a lot of good news, hard-won, but extremely important. The good news is in our shared struggle. No one here can do it all, but as a progressive Jewish community, we can, indeed we must, take on these battles, commit to building civil society in Israel, the United States, and the Global South, commit to creating alliances between and among organizations fighting for change, and commit to standing collectively against the forces that seek to bring people down. The good news is in our individual and collective capacities to be upstanders, to educate in our own communities, to use our privilege, to share our resources, and to recognize our obligation to pursue justice on the streets of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, in the corridors of American power, and in those many places in the world that believe in and fight for the human and civil rights of all people. All these issues are our issues, not only because they are critical to the future of Israel, of America, and of the world, but because they are central to our Jewish story and our Jewish values. We are told to pursue justice and reminded that we cannot refuse to participate. And over again, we are commanded to remember. This is not a commandment to remember and then wallow in silence or in sadness, but a commandment to use our memory and our history for good. We must use that memory not only to empathize, but to act, to call attention to the urgency of the moment and the importance of shared activism against governments that oppress and deny, to stand with and for inclusion and diversity, to demand gender protection, to be leaders in the fight to welcome the other, and to stop the next genocide. I end with some words of our sages, ancient and modern. The Baal Shem Tov, speaking to memory, said, "Forgetfulness leads to exile, while remembrance is the secret of redemption." Grace Paley reminds us that the only recognizable feature of hope is action. And there is a piece of our Midrash that tells us that to fail to participate in the work of the day is to contribute to the overthrow of the world. It is Elul. Next weekend, let us hear the shofar calling us to action, recommitting us to shared struggle, reminding us to hold fast to our Jewish values and fight for these values as one community committed to justice in Israel, in the United States, and every place in the world. Thank you.